28 years old when taken, 50 years old when returned. Not a day aged. The man appeared at the gates of an asylum outside Cintra, claiming he had come back from where the riders took him. His children were grown. His wife had remarried 7 years after his disappearance, the customary waiting period before declaring someone legally dead. The city he remembered existed only in fragments. Familiar streets leading to unfamiliar destinations, old taverns replaced by new construction, faces that should have been young, now weathered by decades he had not lived. He had been gone 43 years. For him, perhaps days had passed, perhaps weeks. Time moved differently in the place beyond, if time moved at all. The asylum record described how he wept when told the date, not from joy at survival, but from comprehension of what survival had cost. Everyone he loved had become strangers. The world had moved on without him. He was not the first to return with such a story. He would not be the last. The ledgers recorded others. A woman who found her daughter was now a grandmother. A soldier still bleeding from a wound, sustained before his abduction, returned decades later in the same blood-soaked uniform. They spoke of gardens that defied natural law, of elves who moved with the certainty of those who had never known defeat, of places where seasons did not turn and the sun hung motionless in alien skies. Most dismissed these accounts as madness. The mind invents narratives when faced with trauma it cannot process. But the disappeared were real. The absences they left behind remained empty. Accounts from across the continent describe patterns that preceded the hunt's arrival. The sky would change. Witnesses spoke of unnatural colors, though descriptions varied. Sailors noticed first, those whose livelihoods depended on reading weather. Ships delayed departure when the signs appeared. People gathered in taverns rather than face the night alone. What followed was documented. Before the last war with Nilfgaard, over 20 souls vanished from Novigrad's streets when the hunt passed through. Exact counts were never confirmed. Some claimed the number was higher. The missing left behind empty spaces. Their names became warnings. The wild hunt had ridden through. Investigations afterward found no bodies, no blood. Signs of struggle were minimal. Overturned objects, disturbed scenes, but no violence in the conventional sense. Reports commonly mention frost left behind, crystalline patterns on surfaces even in mild weather. The missing came from all walks of life. Craftspeople and laborers, merchants and beggars, those with families and those alone. Their names were recorded in ledgers that would never be closed. They were gone. Not dead, at least not provably so. The distinction mattered to the families who waited. Death brought grief, but it also brought certainty. It brought funerals and inheritances and the ability to move forward. Disappearance brought only the suspension of time. Wives who could not remarry, children who could not inherit, parents who set extra places at tables year after year, just in case. The hunt had passed through the sky like a storm. Accounts differed on the details. Some described skeletal horses whose hoofbeats never touched ground. Others swore they saw riders in corroded armor, faces hidden behind helms that seemed designed to inspire terror rather than provide protection. A few claimed to have heard voices in languages that predated human settlement of the continent. All agreed on the cold. Wherever the hunt passed, the temperature dropped. Breath became visible. Water in wells developed thin skins of ice. Accounts described frost spreading in the wake of the riders, patterns too intricate to be natural, geometries that witnesses found difficult to look at directly. The cold lingered for days after, but the missing never returned, or almost never. Testimony exists, recorded in the ledgers of an asylum outside Cintra, of a man who appeared claiming to have returned from the hunt's grasp. The account described him as appearing approximately 50 years old, though he insisted he was 28. He claimed to have been taken from Novigrad's harbor district on a night when the sky turned strange colors and riders appeared overhead. He remembered very little of what happened between. What he did remember, being pulled upward, though he could not say whether physically or through some other means. A sensation of movement without motion, cold that penetrated deeper than skin or bone, settling into some central part of himself that had no name. And then a place. Fragmentary accounts from others who claimed similar experiences spoke of gardens that should not exist, crystalline structures, beings that resembled elves but carried themselves with a hauteur that made the Encedas seem welcoming by comparison. Some described labor, endless, mindless tasks performed in places where time moved differently. Others remembered only fragments, dreamlike and unreliable. According to the asylum records, the man's children were grown when he returned. His wife had remarried after waiting 7 years, the customary period before a missing person could be declared legally dead. His parents had been buried 3 years prior. The city he remembered bore only superficial resemblance to the one he found. He had not aged a day. The temporal distortion became a recurring pattern in the scattered accounts that survived. A woman taken from a Temerian village returned to find her daughter a grandmother. A soldier abducted near the Pontar Valley reappeared decades later, still wearing the same uniform, still bleeding from the same wound that had brought him down before the riders found him. Those who returned spoke of a world where the normal rules did not apply, where seasons did not turn, where the sun, if it could be called a sun, hung fixed in a sky that shifted through colors unknown on the continent. They spoke of elves, but not the Aen Elle with whom humans had warred and eventually, uneasily, coexisted. These were different. Taller perhaps, colder certainly. They moved with the confidence of those who had never known defeat. The returned called them the Aen Elle. Most people dismissed the accounts as madness. The mind, when faced with trauma it cannot process, invents narratives, unicorns and impossible gardens and cities of crystal. These were the fever dreams of broken psyches, not reliable testimony. The authorities classified the survivors as mentally unsound and moved on, but some listened. In Nilfgaard, an entire school of witchers opened with the specific purpose of studying the wild hunt. The School of the Viper dedicated itself to understanding the patterns, the methods, the nature of this phenomenon that stole people from the world, and occasionally returned them, changed. The school maintained extensive libraries, records of sightings, testimonies, maps that tracked appearances across centuries. The school was eventually dissolved, its knowledge scattered. Whether this happened through political maneuvering, financial collapse, or direct intervention by forces that preferred the wild hunt remained mysterious. The records do not clarify. What remains are fragments, pieces of a larger pattern. The wild hunt didn't appear randomly. Across decades of recorded sightings, scholars who studied the phenomenon noted temporal clusters. The hunt manifested most frequently in the months preceding Great Wars. Before the First Nilfgaardian War, sightings increased across the northern kingdoms. Before the second, the pattern repeated. It was as though something about impending mass conflict drew the riders, or perhaps they served as harbingers in a more literal sense than most wished to believe. Harvest was particularly rich, before blood was shed in great quantities. The correlation could not be proven conclusively. Causation remained elusive. Perhaps the hunt appeared more frequently during times of social upheaval, because chaos provided better cover for disappearances. People vanished during wartime. Refugees flood roads. Record-keeping breaks down. Or perhaps something about the energy of coming violence attracted entities from beyond the known world. The hunt itself offered no explanations. Skellige legends approached the phenomenon differently. On those wind-scarred islands, they called the riders the Wraiths of Murhog. The name derived from the ship that allegedly accompanied the hunt, a vessel said to float through the sky as easily as through water, the Naglfar of Murhog. According to traditions preserved in the island's oral histories, the ship was constructed from the fingernails and toenails of the dead. Whether this represented literal truth or metaphor remained unclear. What was certain, Skelligers who saw the Naglfar approaching practiced a ritual removal of nails from their deceased. The custom predated written records. When pressed to explain its origins, the oldest skalds could only gesture toward the ship, toward the hunt, toward the ancient fear of contributing, even inadvertently, to something terrible. The Skelligers believed the hunt would return during Ragnar Rug, the end of the world. They trained, they prepared, they taught their children songs about the cold that comes from the sky and the riders who steal souls. Whether the preparations would matter when the end came, no one could say, but they prepared nonetheless. The elven legends told a different story. Curiously, the Aen Elle, the elves who had lived on the continent long before humans arrived, had almost nothing to say about the wild hunt. Their extensive oral traditions, which stretched back through millennia, contained no references to spectral riders, no warnings about hunts in the sky, The dwarves, similarly, maintained silence on the subject. This absence carried its own significance. The elder races remembered much. They remembered the world before the conjunction of the spheres, when magic existed but flowed differently. They remembered their first encounters with humans, the wars that followed, the bitter compromises that established the current order. They remembered dragons when dragons were common. They remembered when the forest of Brokilon stretched twice its current size. But they didn't remember the wild hunt, or they chose not to speak of it. One fragment survived, preserved in a collection of elven poetry, recovered from ruins near Loch Muini. The translation proved difficult. Elder speech contained nuances that human languages struggled to capture, but the essence spoke of a winter queen who rode during storms, scattering shards of ice that, if they pierced eye or heart, would trap the victim in endless longing. Those afflicted would abandon everything to chase after her, seeking a dream they could never reach. Beautiful, tragic, and, according to some, a description of the wild hunt stripped of its horror, and dressed in romance. Whether the elves knew more than they revealed, or whether the hunt truly represented a phenomenon that postdated the elder race's arrival on the continent, remained uncertain. The silence itself became another mystery, layered over an already inexplicable occurrence. The truth, when it finally emerged, came from unexpected sources. A girl named Cyrilla encountered the hunt directly during the wars that ravaged the northern kingdoms. She was fleeing through a storm when they appeared, riders against a sky that had torn itself open. She described the lead rider, massive, mounted on a steed as huge as a dragon, wearing armor decorated with a helm that bore demonic horns. Behind him rode others, their armor the blood-red color of the setting sun. She escaped, but barely. Later, through circumstances involving travel between worlds, a capability possessed by very few, Ciri found herself in a place called Tir Nalia. There she learned what scholars had suspected but could not prove. The wild hunt was not spectral. They were elves, specifically Aen Elle, elves who had left the main world during the conjunction of the spheres, finding or creating a new realm for themselves. In their world, they had established dominance. They had fought wars against unicorns, actual unicorns, beings of considerable power, and won, or at least achieved enough victory to capture some and steal from them the ability to traverse the barriers between worlds. With this stolen power, the Aen Elle created the Dir Gruadri, the Red Riders. Their original purpose was simple and terrible: raid other worlds for slaves. The Aen Elle had wiped out or subjugated the human population in their own realm. They needed labor, so they sent the Red Riders through the stolen gates into worlds where humans existed in abundance to take what they needed. To inspire terror and ensure cooperation, the Riders wore armor designed to resemble skeletal remains. They rode exclusively black horses. They used magic to enhance their spectral appearance, making themselves seem like wraiths rather than physical beings. Voice alteration, visual distortions, everything calculated to transform a simple slaving operation into something out of nightmare. It worked. The king of the Aen Elle, Oberon Murtatach, had appointed a general named Eredin Breac Glas to lead the Red Riders. Eredin earned his position through ruthlessness and efficiency. He excelled at exactly the kind of cold pragmatism required to lead interdimensional raids. The Aen Elle called him effective. Those who encountered the hunt called him the king of the wild hunt, even before he actually became a king. That transformation came later, through poison and ambition. But the title proved prophetic. The raiders preferred one world above all others, the world they had originally left, the continent. By the time the Aen Elle returned there, centuries had passed. Humans had taken over. The Aen Seide, their cousins, had been pushed to the margins. The world was different, conquered, but it remained familiar, and it was full of potential slaves who spoke languages close enough to elder speech that basic communication was possible. So the Red Riders came, again and again. For a time, they had full access through the Gate of the Worlds, the power they had stolen from the unicorns. They could bring large forces. They could conduct extended operations. The raids were methodical, planned, devastating in their efficiency. Then the unicorns recovered their strength. The details of how this happened remained unclear, whether through alliance, through their own power gradually reasserting itself, or through intervention from some other force. The unicorns managed to close the gate. Not entirely. The Aen Elle retained partial access through specialized mages they called navigators. These individuals possessed innate abilities to manipulate time and space, gifts that could be shaped and trained and weaponized. But navigator open portals were smaller, weaker. They could send through a limited group, and even then only in spectral form rather than fully physical. The riders appeared as projections, powerful enough to abduct victims but constrained compared to their previous capabilities. The harvest became smaller, which made each raid more precious, more carefully planned. The navigators became crucial to the entire operation. One such navigator was known as Caranthir and Imlerith. Called the Golden Child, he was the product of deliberate breeding. An elven mage named Avallac'h had spent generations trying to create the perfect navigator through selective pairing of individuals with time and space manipulation abilities. Caranthir represented the success of that program. His talents made him indispensable to Eredin, despite a temperament described as rash and prideful. He served as chief navigator, responsible for opening the path that allowed the hunt to reach other worlds. Another general, Imlerith, handled the more direct violence. Where Caranthir provided the means, Imlerith provided the brutality. He favored physical confrontation, direct combat. He wielded a massive mace and carried a shield, preferring to overpower opponents through sheer force rather than tactical elegance. Centuries of Aen Elle wars had honed him into something efficient and terrible. Together, they formed the command structure beneath Eredin. Below them came the regular riders, warriors whose names went largely unrecorded in the accounts that filtered back to the continent. They wore the same skeletal armor. They rode the same black horses. They projected the same spectral horror. But individually, they were unremarkable. Soldiers doing a job. The job happened to involve interdimensional slave raids. But in the context of Aen Elle society, this was simply how things were done. How many riders comprised the hunt at any given time? The question had no clear answer. Accounts mentioned handfuls, a dozen, scores. The numbers varied, possibly because the hunt's composition changed depending on the operation, or possibly because fear magnified perception. 10 riders might seem like 100 when they appeared overhead trailing cold and horror. When Eredin eventually killed King Oberon and took the throne for himself, he appointed Gales as his viceroy. Gales managed the kingdom while Eredin continued leading the hunt personally. Some aspects of leadership could be delegated, but the hunt, that required Eredin's direct attention. The hunt was where he belonged. But for all the riders who remained constant, others vanished. Not permanently, perhaps. Not in the way the abducted vanished, but during specific operations, during specific moments. The hunt rode with members who should not have been there. Unwilling participants, those who had been pressed into service, through bargains or capture or circumstances that left them no choice. The most notable example came from the video games, material that developed from the books but diverged into its own narrative. According to this telling, the sorceress Yennefer of Vengerberg was abducted by the Wild Hunt. Her lover, the witcher Geralt of Rivia, spent over a year searching for her. When he finally located the hunt, he was hopelessly outnumbered. So he made a trade, himself for Yennefer. The hunt accepted. They released the sorceress and took the witcher. Geralt rode with the Wild Hunt for an unspecified duration, participating in raids, doing things he later could not or would not remember clearly. Eventually, a young woman named Cirilla, his adopted daughter, managed to free him. She left him near Kaer Morhen with his memory damaged, perhaps by trauma, perhaps by magic, perhaps by the sheer impossibility of what he had experienced. What Geralt did during his time with the hunt remained largely unexplored. One of the game's developers mentioned that Geralt could not be proud of everything he had done in his past. The implication sat heavy and dark. A witcher, trained to fight monsters, forced to participate in monstrous acts. The specifics were left to imagination, which made them worse. This represented game lore rather than book canon. The books ended differently, in a place of ambiguity that the games chose to resolve through this particular narrative. But even as non-canonical expansion, the story raised questions about the hunt's other riders. How many others had been pressed into service? Few returned abductees spoke of riding with the hunt. Most recalled only enslavement, endless labor in alien environments, tasks performed in places where time moved wrong. but of the spectral cavalry itself, they remained silent, or perhaps those who rode alongside the hunt never returned to tell about it. The distinction mattered. Being abducted was violation enough. Being forced to participate in further abductions, to become part of the machine that had stolen you from your life, that represented a different order of horror. The wild hunt also rode with creatures. Hounds accompanied the riders. Not true dogs, but something else. Something made. According to accounts from those who survived encounters, the hounds were crafted from ice and magic, constructs rather than living creatures. Though they moved with the ferocity of feral animals, they ran alongside the riders like dust clouds trailing a comet, as one poet described them. Gangly, ghoulish things covered entirely in crystalline frost. Their heads were wrong, neither properly canine nor humanoid, but something between, something that resisted easy categorization. The hounds attacked with claws and teeth. They could freeze the ground around them and summon spikes of ice from nothing. Badly wounded, they entered frenzies that made them more dangerous rather than less. And sometimes, during the chaos of a raid, hounds became separated from their masters. They fell to earth and wandered, still bound to their purpose even without riders to direct them. A contract exists from Toussaint describing what was called the Epiarian Phantom, a hunt hound that had become lost during one of the wild hunt's many incursions. It had been terrorizing a rural area for months before a witcher finally tracked it down and destroyed it. The report described armor of thick ice that could only be penetrated through sustained assault, and a single-mindedness that made it impossible to reason with or redirect. The hounds represented another kind of emptiness, created for purpose rather than born into existence. Discarded when they were no longer useful, they haunted the margins of the wild hunt's story, manifestations of power divorced from compassion or even practical consideration. What remains after a raid tells its own story. The frost patterns on doors and walls. The accounts differ on whether these occurred during every appearance or only some, but enough witnesses described ice formations in the wake of the hunt to establish the pattern. The geometries were wrong, too precise, too intricate. Looking at them directly created unease in the observer, as though the patterns themselves carried some residual effect of the magic that created them. The silence. Multiple accounts noted how sound changed during and immediately after the hunt's passage. Normal city noise, carts, voices, animals, would cease. In the quiet, people reported hearing wind where no wind blew. Distant sounds that might have been horns. Occasionally, words in languages they didn't recognize but that felt old, felt wrong, felt like they should not be spoken in the waking world. The cold that lingered. Even in summer, places where the hunt had passed would remain chill for days or weeks. Water that should have been warm ran ice cold. Plants withered. Animals avoided the areas. Gradually, over time, the temperature would normalize, but the memory of that unnatural cold stayed with those who experienced it. And the absences, empty chairs at breakfast tables, apprenticeships left incomplete, businesses that failed because their owners never came home, children who grew up not quite understanding why one parent was simply gone, not dead in any way that brought closure, just missing. Families developed strange customs. Some continued setting places for the vanished, year after year. Others held memorial services despite having no bodies to bury, needing some ritual to mark the loss. Still others simply refused to speak of it, treating the disappearance as though the person had never existed, because that was easier than living in the suspended state between hope and grief. The economic impact alone was substantial. In Novigrad, after the raid that took over 20 people, some claimed the number was closer to 30, though records were incomplete. The city council had to establish special provisions for handling the property and debts of the missing. Could a business continue to operate if its owner might return? Could a spouse remarry? Could children inherit? The legal frameworks that govern normal life buckled under the weight of abnormal circumstances. Some families waited for decades. A few were rewarded. The man recorded in the asylum ledgers, who returned years after his abduction, eventually carved out a new life in a city that barely resembled the one he remembered. He never fully recovered what he had lost, but he found a kind of peace. Others who returned were less fortunate. They found themselves displaced in time, strangers in a world that had moved on without them. Many struggled to adapt. Some succeeded. Others did not. Most never returned at all. The pattern of the hunt's appearances suggested calculation rather than randomness. Eredin and his riders did not simply tear through worlds at random, snatching whoever happened to be available. They planned. They studied. They chose targets based on criteria that made sense to them, if not to their victims. Young, healthy individuals formed the majority of the abducted. The old were rarely taken. Children, similarly, tended to be passed over. The hunt wanted slaves capable of labor, and while the exact nature of that labor remained unclear from the fragments that survivors described, physical capability mattered. Certain professions appeared more frequently in the lists of the missing. Sailors, dock workers, blacksmiths, people with practical skills that could transfer across worlds. Whether this represented conscious selection or simply reflected who was outside during the hours when the hunt preferred to ride remained debatable. The hunt came most often at night, though not exclusively. Dawn and dusk sightings existed. A handful of accounts described midday appearances, though these were rare enough to be considered anomalous. Darkness provided cover, both literal and psychological. Fear worked better when people could not see clearly, when shapes in the sky might be nightmare or might be real. Winter was traditional, but not mandatory. The association came partly from the cold the hunt brought, which felt more natural during winter months. But the hunt appeared in summer too, in spring and autumn. Seasons seemed to matter less than other factors: the presence of conflict, the concentration of suitable targets, or perhaps rhythms that had nothing to do with the turning of the continent's year and everything to do with cycles in the Aen Elle world that humans could not perceive. Before the White Frost, a catastrophe that game lore introduced but book lore did not address, the hunt operated according to its own timetable. After, in the game's telling, urgency drove them. Their world was dying. They needed a solution. They needed Ciri, specifically, for her ability to traverse worlds and to potentially halt or escape the frost. The raids became more frequent, more desperate, less about gathering slaves and more about capturing one specific individual. This represented a shift, a change in the pattern. The hunt had always been frightening, but it had operated within certain parameters. It was predictable in its unpredictability. Raids came, people vanished, life continued. The new desperation made it more dangerous because desperate beings make mistakes, take risks, abandon caution. Eredin, pushing harder than ever before, brought the hunt into direct conflict with forces powerful enough to fight back, which was how eventually the hunt ended, or at least how one telling of the story concluded. The defeat of the Wild Hunt, detailed in the game lore, came through a combination of preparation, betrayal, and circumstances aligning in ways that even the most powerful Aen Elle could not have anticipated. Geralt, having recovered from his time riding with the hunt, dedicated himself to finding Ciri and protecting her from Eredin's pursuit. He assembled allies. He consulted with mages who understood portal magic. He learned everything available about the hunt's patterns and weaknesses. The knowledge proved crucial, but it was not enough on its own. Avallac'h, the elven mage who had created Caranthir through selective breeding, turned against Eredin for reasons that remained complex. He had his own goals regarding Ciri and the elder blood she carried, but whatever his ultimate intentions, they did not align with Eredin's, and his assistance proved vital in creating opportunities to strike back against the hunt. Gales, the viceroy left in charge while Eredin led raids, learned of his king's betrayal. Eredin had poisoned King Oberon to claim the throne. When presented with evidence, Gales chose to withdraw support. He would not send reinforcements when Eredin called. He would not defend the king when the king was absent from their world. This left Eredin exposed. The battle that ended the hunt, or at least ended Eredin's leadership of it, took place in the Skellige Isles. The Naglfar appeared above the frozen sea. Caranthir used his navigator abilities to freeze an entire bay, trapping ships and soldiers in ice. Ciri confronted him, destroying his staff and breaking the spell, though the effort left her vulnerable. Imlerith had died earlier, killed by Geralt in revenge for the murder of Vesemir, the old witcher who had helped raise both Geralt and Ciri. The general's death removed one of Eredin's key supporters and reduced the hunt's military effectiveness. With Caranthir dead and Gales refusing to send aid, Eredin stood alone. The final confrontation happened aboard the Naglfar. As the ship burned, Geralt and Eredin fought through portals, across different worlds, before returning to the ship where it all ended. Geralt drove his sword through one of the openings in Eredin's mask, piercing the eye. The king of the Wild Hunt died on the deck of his own vessel. With his death, the hunt as it had existed ceased. Whether other Aen Elle continued raiding in some form, whether the tradition persisted in diminished capacity, the sources did not clarify. But the organized, systematic hunts led by Eredin, those were finished. The empty saddles, at last, stayed empty. What the ending meant for those still trapped in the Aen Elle world remained unclear. If the hunt truly served primarily as a slaving operation, the slaves did not automatically gain freedom when Eredin died. The infrastructure that relied on their labor continued existing. The society that had been built partially on their backs did not transform overnight. Some of the abducted might have found ways to escape in the chaos following Eredin's defeat. The portals Caranthir had opened might have remained briefly accessible. Or perhaps other navigators, no longer directed by the King of the Hunt, chose different priorities that did not include maintaining prison worlds. But most likely, the vast majority remained where they had been taken. This represents the part of the story that goes untold. The Hunt's spectral appearances made for dramatic accounts. The abductions created mysteries and tragedies that resonated through communities for generations. The battles and confrontations between Geralt's allies and Eredin's forces provided the structure for heroic narratives. But somewhere in Tir in the Aen Elle world, people who had been stolen from the continent decades or centuries ago continued their existence. They aged according to that world's different time. If they aged at all, they performed whatever tasks their masters set. They remembered perhaps lives they had once lived, though memory dulls given enough time. They became the permanent ghosts, the ones who never returned even when the hunt that had taken them was defeated. Their empty chairs remained empty. The pattern repeated across all the raids, all the victims, all the years. For every survivor documented in asylum records who returned, for every fragmentary account preserved of impossible places and temporal distortions, dozens or hundreds or thousands more simply vanished into a place beyond reach. The Wild Hunt stole people from the world, and the world for the most part could do nothing but mark the absence and continue on. The folklore that predated the truth understood this on some level. Long before anyone confirmed that the hunt consisted of Aen Elle raiders, rather than actual specters, the story spoke of permanence, of losses that could not be recovered. The souls taken by the Wild Hunt did not return. Seeing the hunt meant doom, not in the sense that you personally would be taken necessarily, but that someone would, that the hunt's appearance marked a boundary crossing from normal existence into something else. The Skellige prophecies about Ragnar Rug position the hunt not just as raiders, but as harbingers of the end times. When the world finally collapsed, the hunt would be there. Naglfar would sail with armies of the dead. The riders would claim final vengeance against the living. This represented mythologizing, certainly, transforming a dangerous but ultimately explainable phenomenon into apocalyptic metaphor. But the core insight remained valid. The hunt meant change. It meant endings. For the individuals taken, it meant the end of the life they had known. For the families left behind, it meant the end of completeness, of the unit they had been. For societies that experienced raids, it meant the end of the illusion that anywhere was truly safe. The hunt proved that boundaries could be crossed, that walls and guards and distance meant nothing, that even in the middle of a fortified city, even surrounded by thousands of other people, you could simply vanish. The randomness was part of the terror. You could take all the precautions in the world and still be selected, or you could take no precautions and be passed over. No pattern protected you. No behavior guaranteed safety. The hunt came, or it did not. If it came, you might be taken, or you might be spared. And if you were taken, you might return, or you might not. Every step represented another roll of dice, weighted by factors you could neither see nor understand. After Eredin's defeat, the world did not transform. The missing remained missing. The dead remained dead. Families that had spent decades waiting for impossible returns continued waiting, because what else could they do? The infrastructure established to handle the legal complications of disappearances remained in place because new disappearances continued, even if not caused by the hunt. People vanished for mundane reasons: crime, accidents, choices to start over elsewhere. But every unexplained absence carried the shadow of possibility. Maybe the hunt had not truly ended. Maybe it had only paused. Maybe it would return. Fear has a longer half-life than the thing that caused it. Memorials were eventually erected in cities that had experienced losses, not immediately and not always prominently, but in time markers appeared bearing the names of the missing. No dates of death because no deaths had been confirmed, just names and the years they were last seen. Families visited, left flowers, touched the stone as though physical contact could somehow reach across the barrier between worlds and touch those who had been taken. The ritual mattered more than its effectiveness. Doing something, even something symbolic, was better than doing nothing. Other cities established similar memorials. In time, the names blurred together. The specific people became representative of a larger category, victims of the wild hunt. Their individual stories, the details that made them unique, those were largely forgotten. They became symbols, warnings, cautionary tales told to children, but to their families, they remained individuals, specific people with specific habits and specific laughs. Each had been someone particular. Before becoming another name on a list, the hunt reduced them to absences, to empty spaces in the world, to questions that had no answers. That was perhaps the cruelest aspect, not the abductions themselves, though those were terrible enough, but the erasure, the way people became gaps instead of people, the way their stories ended mid-sentence with no punctuation, no resolution, just the sentence ending and the next page being blank. Some stories resisted erasure better than others. Geralt's time with the hunt, even though it came from game lore rather than book canon, became known. Songs were written about it. Terrible songs mostly, but songs nonetheless. The story of the witcher who traded himself for his lover, who rode with nightmares and survived, who helped bring down the king of the wild hunt himself. It had the elements of legend, sacrifice, redemption, revenge. It was also, notably, a story with an ending. Most of those taken by the hunt never got endings. They got ellipses, suspended moments, the forever of not knowing. But Geralt's story concluded. He survived, he fought back, he won, in the way these things can be won. And because his story had structure and resolution, it spread more easily than the formless tragedies of those who simply vanished. This created its own problem. The exception began to overshadow the rule. People remembered that someone had escaped the hunt, had even ridden with it and returned. They forgot that this was extraordinary. They forgot that for every Geralt, for every survivor whose account survived in asylum ledgers or scholars' notes, hundreds or thousands more never came back. The exceptions gave false hope. Families waiting for returns latched onto the stories of survivors. If one person could come back after years or decades, why not another? Why not their husband, their daughter, their brother? The stories of survival, meant to inspire or commemorate, instead prolonged the agony of waiting. Eventually, most gave up. Grief has a natural progression when allowed to run its course. The missing complicated this progression. They trapped people in early stages, denial, bargaining, unable to reach acceptance because the loss was never confirmed. Some families created their own confirmations, held funeral rites even without bodies, declared their missing dead after whatever period they decided was long enough, forced closure that reality refused to provide. This was healthier than endless waiting, though it came with its own guilt. What if they were wrong? What if the missing did return, only to find they had been given up on, declared dead, forgotten? No choice was clean. No option was without cost. The wild hunt left scars across the continent that persisted long after Eredin died. Psychological scars in communities that had experienced raids, economic scars in cities that had lost significant portions of their workforce or commercial networks, cultural scars in the proliferation of protective rituals and superstitions that might or might not do anything but gave people the illusion of agency. Customs developed in the wake of the hunt's appearances. Some villages developed practices meant to ward off the riders, rituals involving iron, salt, or other materials believed to hold protective properties against otherworldly beings. The specifics varied by region and often contradicted one another, suggesting they arose independently rather than from any confirmed knowledge of what actually worked. Whether any of these practices affected the hunt was never established. The hunt took or didn't take according to its own logic, but the rituals provided structure. They gave people things to do. They transformed helplessness into action, even if the action was ultimately meaningless. Skellige's practice of removing nails from the dead carried more weight because it predated living memory. No one could point to the origin. No one could say definitively whether it helped. But the tradition continued because abandoning it felt like inviting catastrophe. Better to maintain a possibly useless custom than risk being the generation that stopped and then faced consequences. The hunt had ended, supposedly. Eredin was dead. Caranthir was dead. Imlerith was dead. The leadership was gone. But traditions built over centuries of fear did not vanish just because the thing that inspired them had been defeated once. People remembered. They passed down the stories. They taught their children the signs to watch for: bone-colored skies, unseasonable cold, the sound of horns carried on windless air. They told them what to do if the hunt appeared, even though what to do mostly amounted to hide and hope and pray to whatever gods you believed in. Because even defeated once, the hunt represented a category of threat that could return. Different leaders, different riders, same fundamental danger. The Aen Elle still existed. Their world still existed. The portals between worlds could still be opened. Eredin's death closed one chapter. It did not guarantee that new chapters would not be written. In the aftermath, in the spaces between raids and returns and remembrances, certain questions remained unanswered. How many had the Wild Hunt taken across all the years of its operation? The number was unknowable. Records were incomplete. Many disappearances went unreported, especially in rural areas, especially during times of war when chaos made accounting impossible. Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands, possibly. More than that, perhaps, if the hunt had been operating since the conjunction of the spheres, as some scholars suggested. Each number represented a person, a life interrupted, a set of connections severed. The numbers became too large to contemplate meaningfully. They lost individual shape and became statistics. But somewhere, each statistic had been someone specific who woke up one morning with no idea it would be their last on the continent. What happened to most of them? The fragments from returned abductees suggested slave labor in the Aen Elle world, but the details remained vague. Hard work in alien environments, tasks that made little sense, time that moved strangely. These descriptions sketched an outline without filling in the picture. Were they treated well? Poorly? Somewhere between? The Aen Elle perspective, as much as it could be inferred from the limited interactions recorded, suggested they did not consider humans to be equals. They were tools, resources, useful for certain purposes but not deserving of consideration beyond their utility. Some of the taken might have adapted, might have found ways to build lives within their captivity, might have formed connections with other captives, creating shadow communities in the gaps of Aen Elle society, might have forgotten, eventually, that they had come from somewhere else. Memory is not fixed. Given enough time and enough difference, even strong memories can fade into uncertainty. Others would have resisted, would have maintained their sense of self, their identity as not Aen Elle, their connection to a world they could no longer reach, would have held on to hope of return even when that hope became irrational, would have remembered the names and faces of those they had left behind, even as those names and faces became impossible to verify, easy to doubt. Both responses were valid. Both were survival. The empty saddles carried multiple meanings layered over one another. Literally, saddles without riders. The hunt riding with fewer members than it had started with. Caranthir dead, Imlerith dead. Generic warriors fallen in combat with Geralt and his allies. The spectral cavalry diminished, reduced, until finally there was only Eredin, and even he fell. Metaphorically, places in the world that should have been filled but were not. The chairs at breakfast tables, the positions in workshops, the roles in families. Every person taken left a gap shaped like themselves that nothing else could properly fill. Symbolically, the absence as its own presence. The way not being there became almost as powerful as being there. The missing haunted the edges of normal life, reminders that normal could end without warning, that security was illusion, that the boundaries between worlds were thinner than most preferred to believe. After Eredin's defeat, those empty saddles did not fill immediately. The Aen Elle world continued existing. It presumably still needed labor. It presumably still had the capacity to open portals. The infrastructure the hunt had built, the knowledge, the magic, the established routes between worlds, did not vanish just because the king died. Whether the Aen Elle chose to continue raids under different leadership, or whether they found other solutions to their needs, or whether they simply withdrew and stopped interacting with the continent entirely, the sources did not specify. The uncertainty itself became significant, because without confirmation that the threat had ended permanently, communities had to continue operating as though it might return. They had to maintain vigilance, teach the next generation the old stories, keep the memorials fresh. The hunt's legacy was its absence, not just the people it took, but the shadow it cast. The awareness that there existed forces beyond normal comprehension that could reach across impossible distances and tear holes in the fabric of reality. That magic was not just fireballs and healing spells, but could bend the basic rules that governed existence. The world recovered from many things: wars, plagues, natural disasters. Each left scars, but the scars eventually faded into history. The hunt's scars remained visible because they were still open, still present. The missing had not returned. The families still waited. The threat, while diminished, had not been conclusively eliminated. Some waited a lifetime. Stories circulated of those who maintained vigils for the missing. Accounts describe individuals who continued setting extra places at tables, who kept belongings exactly as they had been, who refused to accept that their loved ones would not return. Whether these represented specific documented cases or composite narratives built from scattered reports, they captured a truth about how families responded to inexplicable loss. Waiting might have been irrational, but it was something that people could do. It was a choice they could make in a situation that had robbed them of choices. Across the continent, others waited, some openly, others privately, acknowledging to the world that they had accepted the loss while secretly maintaining smaller rituals. A drawer that still held clothes, a name mentioned in daily prayers, a hope they would never admit to but could not entirely abandon. The hunt had taken their loved ones, but it could not take the waiting. That belonged to those left behind. It was the one thing they still controlled. For those seeking to understand the full scope of what the wild hunt represented, it is important to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The hunt was a group of Aen Elle warriors conducting organized raids for practical purposes. This is documented and verified across multiple sources. Books and games alike describe the mechanics, the leadership structure, the goals. The hunt was also something more. It was a manifestation of existential dread, the fear that nothing is truly safe, that no boundary is genuinely secure, that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than comfortable daily life suggests. Both are true. Eredin and his riders wore armor and rode horses and opened portals according to principles of magic that could theoretically be understood and countered. They were not literally demons or death itself. They were beings from another world with goals and strategies and vulnerabilities. But to those who witnessed the spectral riders tearing across the sky, to those who lost loved ones to the hunt, to those who lived with the knowledge that they might be next, for all of them, the hunt was also a nightmare made real. It was the darkness at the edge of the map. It was every story about things that steal people in the night made manifest. Both are true. Understanding this duality helps make sense of the hunt's lasting impact. If it were only practical raiders, the defeat of Eredin would have closed the book. Threat neutralized, move on. If it were only mythic terror, it would have no substance to fight, no way to resist. But because it was both, its defeat addressed one dimension while leaving the other intact. The actual wild hunt led by Eredin was finished. The terror of what it represented lingered. Those who study the wild hunt today, scholars examining historical records, mages researching cross-world travel, bards shaping the story into performable ballads, focus on different aspects depending on their discipline. The historians want timelines, confirmed dates of appearances, correlation with other events, the mechanics of how societies adapted to this recurring threat. The mages want theory. How did the portals work? What energy sources powered the navigation? Could the techniques be reproduced or countered? What does the hunt reveal about the fundamental nature of reality and its malleability? The bards want drama, heroes and villains, sacrifice and redemption, sorrow and triumph. They want stories that can be compressed into song, that can make people feel something, that will be remembered. Each approaches the truth from different angles. None captures it complete. The sum of all perspectives begins to approximate the full picture, but only begins. What remains constant across all the examinations and analyses and creative interpretations is the fundamental fact: the Wild Hunt took people who never returned. That is the irreducible core. Everything else, the explanations, the resistance, the victories, the mythologizing, builds from that foundation. Empty saddles, empty chairs, empty spaces in the world shaped like people who used to be there. The hunt ended, the absence remained. For those who wish to understand more about how the world the Wild Hunt terrorized came to be, more stories wait in other chronicles. The forces that shaped the continent, the magic systems that made such terrors possible, the societies that had to learn to live with threats beyond normal comprehension. Share this knowledge with others who might benefit from understanding that the dark between worlds is not empty, and that what rides through it does not always respect the boundaries the living prefer to maintain.